December 1620, off the coast of New England. The Mayflower came within 6 miles of Plymouth Bay, but then the wind changed direction, blowing them northwest, and they had to retreat again to Cape Cod. The following day, 16th of December, they were more successful, and the Mayflower dropped anchor at the entrance to Plymouth Harbour. From here the passengers could see the land that the shore party had selected. They sent a party ashore, and Will was again one of them. Will's first impression had been right. It was a good place, with trees of many sorts, fruit trees, plum, cherry, apple, and herbs including leeks and onions, flax and hemp. There was gravel and an excellent clay for making pots. Best of all, the soil was a soft black loam, rich and fat. There were fish in the sea and also fresh streams, the water of which was as sweet as any Will had ever tasted. He took pleasure in just the act of exploration, and it lifted his spirits temporarily. The next day they travelled along the coast and came to a river, which they named Jones River, after the master of the ship. Will wondered why they were looking further. He liked the first landing place. Others agreed with him when, after travelling 3 miles up the river, they decided that it was too woody to defend from Indian attack. Clark Island also was far too woody and too cold, and there was no fresh water, and they had no mind to be digging wells. As Will pointed out, they had enough to do without that. Already it was 19th December. They were running low on food. Almost half the company was sick, and the need to find a place to settle had become urgent. "I cast my vote for the land we first saw," Edward Wilmslow said, "on the high ground. The land has been cleared and planted with corn 3 or 4 years ago. The brook runs under the hill nearby, and there are many freshwater springs for drinking." Will agreed. "We can harbour our shallop and boats in the river, and there's good fishing too." Miles Standish rubbed his face. "It sounds reasonable to me. We can put a force on the hill which will command all sides, and we can also see into the bay and into the sea, and also Cape Cod itself." As ever, the military aspects concerned him most. "But we'll have to fetch the wood," John Carver pointed out. "Well, it ain't that far," Will said. "Half of a quarter of a mile, if that." "Far enough when one is having to lug it and build with it," John Carver grumbled, in his bombastic way. Will glanced at him, concerned. John Carver was feeling his age, he thought, the rigours of the exploration taking its toll on him. "So what do we do next?" Christopher Martin asked. John Carver took charge, which as governor he was supposed to do. "We shall send 20 men ashore to make a start, and then all can come ashore tomorrow to begin building." "We must build a guardhouse," Miles Standish suggested, and it sounded more like an order. "A common house," John Carver agreed, beaming suddenly. "A good idea. Faith, I wish I'd thought of it myself." He paused as he imagined it in his mind's eye. "A house for sheltering in. We can put a fire in there, for meeting in, for storing things in. Once we have one building up, we can start on the others," Will agreed, his mind set on the fire which would warm him then. He hadn't been warm since they left England. However, the wind got up in the night, blew a ferocious gale, and by morning the rain lashed down, and there was hardly enough light to see by. Will, still on land with the shore party, did his best to ignore it, but in a short while he was soaked through to his skin yet again. "We ought to be getting back to the ship," he said through gritted teeth. He'd had enough of being cold and wet, and that's where the shelter was. John Carver, crouching down and hunched over in his cloak, the rain beating down on his hat, looked up at Will with eyes as full of misery as his own. "You can't put to sea in such conditions." They spent the day and night on land, wet, cold and hungry. Will crouched in miserable silence, depressed. He had nothing to do but watch the rain as it lashed down in a steady torrent, and wish that they were somewhere dry and warm. His face and hands were numb with cold, his hair dripping, and when he tilted his head, water poured off his soggy hat brim in a stream. It was impossible to sleep, impossible to make a fire, and there was no shelter of any sort. Mary Brewster had been up all night, and it was morning before she rejoined her husband in their own berth. He had not been there long himself. As she slipped behind the curtain, quietly so as not to disturb the boys who slept still, he reached up for her and pulled her down into the bed against him, wrapping the blanket over her. Softly in the darkness, in the warmth of his arms, she wept. "It wasn't your fault," he said in a low voice. "No, it was too early. Mistress Allison said so herself. Such a small little mite. Didn't even cry." "Richard Britteridge died last night too," Brewster whispered grimly. "There'll be many more deaths if we don't get off this ship." His arms tightened around her. "What have I brought you to?" She stopped, crying abruptly, and looked up at him in the dim light of a distant lantern, suddenly gaining strength. "To a new world. Who hath heard such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once? I didn't think it was going to be easy." As the weather abated a little, they managed to get the boat off to the shore party with provisions, but he could not return to the ship. The weather finally eased on 23rd December, and as many as could went ashore and began the laborious task of felling timber for building. The next day was a Sabbath, when no one did any work, but that did not stop Solomon Prower, the stepson of the odious Christopher Martin, from dying of the sickness. The following day was the 25th of December, but the Pilgrims did not celebrate Christmas, for they viewed it as unscriptural, a pagan celebration, the date chosen because of the winter solstice. So they worked, sawing, riving, carrying timber, and they began to erect the first building, the common house, a timber-framed affair of whittle and daub, just as they had been used to in England. It was the easiest and quickest way of doing things. The common house was 20 feet square, and once they had thatched the roof, they intended to move supplies from Mayflower ashore. It was a good sign that heartened them, even though the sickness continued to claim lives. John Craxton died. Christopher Martin's wife, Marie, mother of Solomon Prower, died. Alice and John Rigdale died, and all the Tillys got ill. Diggory Priest died at the beginning of January, as did Christopher Martin, who annoyed them all so intensely. "We've got to get the people off the ship," John Carver announced, pausing in the act of chopping at a tree, desperation in his voice. William Brewster agreed. "The foul air of the ship breeds sickness. We need clean, warm housing." He swung his axe, and a chip of wood flew out of the groove he made in the trunk. "It is a waste of time and energy to have most of the shore party rowing back to the ship each night," Will put in. For although the common house was good to shelter some of the sick, like a makeshift hospital, there was not room for everyone. "Well, we can't build any faster," John Carver snapped, throwing down his axe. Will looked around him at the trees, good thick wood for building, and sighed. Tempers were fraying yet again. and even good-natured, bluff John Carver had fallen victim to the stress. "Half of the company are now sick," Will said. "Daily more become sick, and people are dying." "You think I don't know that?" Carver raged. "Am I God that I should stop a sickness?" "If we could get some cottages up," Will pressed his point, standing his ground. John Carver looked as though he searched for a suitable oath, and his face darkened with rage. Brewster came between them. "You are right. Of course you are, Will. But we are doing all that we can." Will nodded. "I know." He felt frustrated at the time it was taking. "I'm sorry, John." "We're all anxious about the people who are dying," William Brewster said. "Tomorrow we begin erecting cottages," John Carver announced, weather permitting. The weather didn't permit. For half the week it halted their activities completely, while on the ship the sickness became an epidemic.